We're privileged to have a guest speaker this evening. Our speaker is joining us from the St. Louis Vedanta Center. He was initiated by Swami Satprakashananda in 1976 at St. Louis. There he was doing administration and publication tasks. He was initiated into Brahmacharya by Swami Savagatananda in 1987 and took his final monastic vows in 1995. Now, because Swami Savagatananda has such a close tie, he was our dear Swamiji for many years here, consider this Swami, our guest speaker tonight, as having a strong connection with Providence as well. He's a brilliant expounder of Vedantic themes and uses a great deal of humor in his talks. And for those of you who are here Friday night, I'll just capture an essence of what he was able to combine the ancient Vedantic wisdom with 1960s Americana by way of the show To Tell the Truth. And he asked the provocative question, will the real Atman please stand up? Concluding with, that since that's not possible, will the false ego please sit down? So since it's been 10 years or more since he's last been here, I don't want to spend any more time standing between you and him. So please welcome to the Vedanta podium, Swami Nishpapananda.
Thank you for that entertaining introduction. I'm always happy to come back here and be in this holy space. Although this is a slightly different holy space than I was in the last time I was here, it feels pretty much the same. And so many of you I know from many years ago, and I'm happy to see new faces here as well. I was asked by Swami Agatamanandaji to come in and give a couple of talks here while he was away doing this type of work in Canada. And then he said, well, he says, don't leave right away, wait until I get back and so we can see each other. And I was happy to see him in the kitchen when I arrived on Friday cooking. So I get the best of both worlds here. I get to be with you, and I get to be with Swami Agatamananda also. Now, how long am I supposed to speak? Till 5:45? Something like that? Okay. So we'll start with a Sanskrit prayer. Asato ma satkamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityorma amritam gamaya abhirabhima eti rudrayate dakshinamukam te namam pahi nityam om shanti shanti shanti. Lead us from the ever-changing to the unchanging. Lead us from the darkness of ignorance to the light of the Spirit. Lead us from the death of the body to the eternal life of the divine. Light us through and through, and guide us evermore with thy loving presence. Peace, peace, peace. The subject is karma and divine grace. What is karma? Karma is usually translated as work when it's translated into English. But karma and work are not quite the same. Karma has implications that work does not have. Karma means volitional action, the work that is done deliberately, consciously, and with self-determination. And karma covers a range of activity of both body and mind. What you do with the body is karma. What is perceived by the senses is karma. We see and smell a flower. We hear a bee buzzing around the flower. This is all karma. All those sensory perceptions create impressions in the mind. If you deliberately decide to sit quietly, you're apparently doing no work, but that sitting quietly is also karma. It's done with intention. You are sitting quietly because you decided to sit quietly, and that is karma. If you lie down deliberately with the intention of avoiding work, it is not work, but it is karma. It is done intentionally, and it makes an impression upon the mind, and that impression on the mind will have a slight tendency to push us to similar karma in the future. We think with the mind, or we deeply feel for a person or a thing, for instance, a nice new shiny car, or we will something. These functions of the mind are all considered karma. But the autonomic functions of the body, like digestion and blood circulation, are not considered karma. They are involuntary. The will is not involved, and they are not karma. Instinctive or reflex actions are also not karma. Sneezing or closing the eyes when something is suddenly brought very close to the eyes is not karma. They're reflex actions. And the more interest that we take and the more attention that we pay to a work, the deeper the impression on the mind. And it's not just a work. The more attention we pay to a work, a thought, a feeling, or a sensation, the deeper the impression that is made on the mind. It's karma. And that karma produces two effects. There is a tangible and immediate effect. If you feed a person, I've been fed a lot since I got here. It's all good. If you feed a person, his stomach is filled, and you get the immediate satisfaction for having fed him. But in addition to that immediate effect, karma produces an impression on the mind. And we're constantly gathering those impressions from our various activities, including our perceptions through the senses, our thoughts, our intentions, the things we will to do. Now, this is a very important difference between karma and work. Sitting and watching the television and relaxing is not considered work, but it's considered karma to the extent that we pay attention to those images and those sounds that are coming from the tube or from the internet. And those create impressions on the mind that are strong to the extent that we pay attention to them. So we think we're not doing anything, but we're actually doing quite a bit. We're exposing ourselves to influences without really considering the consequences that those influences might have on us karmically. It's something to consider. We're changing ourselves in a subtle way as we pay attention to those things kind of in a relaxed manner. The advertisers know this. They understand how karma works. They don't call it karma, but they certainly understand it. As I mentioned the other day, they'll try to make you think that what you really want is what they've got. They'll say, Coke is the real thing. We know Brahman is the real thing, you see. They'll say Coke is happiness. That's the Ananda aspect, you see. They're selling the existence aspect. They're selling the Ananda aspect. They have to think of a way now to sell the consciousness aspect. They're very much aware of this. And we should be aware of this as devotees. What we do casually can have an effect on us that we may not like so much. I'll get back to this. I'm not going to leave this one alone. In addition to the immediate effect karma produces, an impression on the mind. Out of the impressions that we're constantly gathering, our disposition is created. Out of these impressions, we develop talents like playing a musical instrument or hitting a baseball. In this way, our memories, our talents, our inclinations, our disposition, our character come from these karmic impressions. In Sanskrit, samskaras. The second effect of the karmic impressions is more subtle. These karmic impressions are stored within the mind as very subtle moral forces that become, in the course of time, retributive forces. At some time in the future, these forces, these samskaras, become activated again and create favorable or unfavorable situations for us. In that sense, they are moral forces. If the intention motivating a particular karma is benign and loving, that comes back to us in the course of time, and it may take a very long time, as a favorable situation. The opposite is true if the motive associated with a karma is negative, arising from malicious feelings, jealousy, anger, pride, and so forth. We know those. Yeah. These come back to us eventually as unfavorable situations. Now, apart from the impressions that create our disposition, our character, our talents, and our memories, we have these other impressions as moral forces which become retributive eventually. When the body dies, the mind, and someone asked a question the other day about the mind. I'm getting to that here. When the body dies, the mind, with all its contents, with every karmic impression, that includes television, goes with the departing soul. Those samskaras, do you really want to take the Lone Ranger into your next life? Those samskaras eventually create favorable or unfavorable situations for the individual according to their nature, good, bad, or mixed. Most of them are mixed. These karmic impressions reach fruition in this life or in future lives. Death can't nullify them. Distance can't avert them. Wherever a person will go, these impressions will go with him or her. Time can't erase them. Time may pass, but these karmic impressions will not lose their force or potency. These karmic impressions, in fact, this is a little scary. These karmic impressions, in fact, can be more durable than the physical universe. Now, what do I mean by that? This is getting serious. Do you really want to take the Lone Ranger into the next Kalpa? Or Coke? So, you've got the universe. According to the Vedantic cosmology, it gets started somehow, and it keeps going for billions and billions of years. And then it kind of goes into cold storage. It's called pralaya. Well, what happens to those individual souls who have not achieved liberation during that cosmic cycle? Well, they go into cold storage. The mother puts them in her spice bag, and she'll take them out when it's time to start things up again. So the universe is gone, and those souls are still waiting, to find out what happened in the last episode of The Lone Ranger. It's kind of scary, these little impressions, these little things that we do all the time. Kind of unconsciously, we're half paying attention, they're creating some scars, and those little samskaras are going to be with us for a long time. Now, go into a little interlude here. The existence of the soul that leaves the body at the time of death, is beyond the range of the senses. We know from our sacred literature, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, that Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Premananda and those great ones could see the soul as it was leaving the body or as it was struggling with death. Swami Premananda on his deathbed, or what people thought was his deathbed, people were thinking that he was dying, and he was kind of observing his tug of war between his soul and death. And he says, don't worry. He said, when my mother gave me to the master, she extracted two promises. First, does anyone give something for nothing? You want my Barbara? She wasn't like that. She was a nice lady. She said she wanted two boons. She said, first, may I have devotion to the Lord. May I have true bhakti. And the other one, may I not suffer the bereavement of any of my children. And Baburam Maharaj says, don't worry. She says, my mother's alive. I won't die. But for most of us, the existence of the soul is beyond the range of the senses. We have to take it on faith. And how do we know? How do we know that our good actions come back to us in future lives? How do we know that the soul reincarnates? How do we know that there's a soul at all? It's a matter of faith. How do we know that the samskaras go with the soul and that the Lone Ranger lasts for a long time? The karmic impressions, not only of this life, but of all past lives. And how do we know that we have past lives? These are things, they're subtle truths. They're beyond the range of the senses. And they're beyond the range of the instruments that extend the range of the senses, at least at this time. We know about the law of karma from the testimony of the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Yoga Sutras and a host of succeeding Hindu sages. Like the truth Atman is Brahman, the law of karma is testimony from beyond the range of the senses. Now, we live in a world culture, and a mass system of education that honors truth that can be verified through the senses above all else. Is there any evidence from our time here and now that corroborates some of the things that we're talking about in the law of karma? I think there is, and I want to talk about this a little bit. Two things, the near-death experience and something that's often experienced during a near-death experience called a panoramic life review. The best scientific research that's been done on this is by a Dutch cardiologist named Pim van Lommel. He did the first prospective study on the near-death experience starting in 1988. It took 10 or 15 years to complete it. He got 4 hospitals in Holland on board, And whenever any of the heart patients suffered cardiac arrest, there was a follow-up. A few days later, 2 or 3 days after the event, someone that was trained would interview them and ask if there was anything, if they have a reported memory of anything that happened while their heart was stopped. And what they found, they had a large enough number of subjects to have a scientific, statistical validity for this study. Out of 344 cardiac arrest patients, 18% had reported a near-death experience. Now, what happens during the near-death experience? First of all, for most people, it's a very powerful experience. It's a very emotional experience, and the intensity of that experience doesn't fade over time. For most people that have it, it's the most impressive experience of their life, always, even after a time span of even 50 years. There are certain universal elements in this experience. And it's important to note that it can't happen. It's not possible for the near-death experience to happen. And the reason it's not possible is that our current theory, the scientific theories of what consciousness is and how subjective consciousness arises, it is that consciousness arises from brain function, and the brain's not functioning while the heart is stopped. All the activity in the brain stops about 15 seconds after the heart stops beating. This can be verified, and it was verified with these patients because a lot of them had cardiac arrest while they were being operated on. Then consciousness stops. And yet these people came back with reports of, yes, I saw what was happening in the operating room, and they'll tell you who said what to whom and what they were feeling. And not only they're able to report on this, but they're able to report on it in a more detailed and vivid manner than they would if they were in a conscious state. Instead, they're in the process of dying. And their brain shouldn't be, and their mind shouldn't be working at all because their brain is not working. So, and all the arguments that have been put forth as to why the near-death experience can't happen are kind of refuted by these real scientific studies that verify how much oxygen is going to the brain, whether there are any EEG readings from the brain during this event. Okay, so these are the elements of a near-death experience. I'm just going to list them, and then we'll go specifically into the life review that happens during some of these experiences. First, there's an experience of being out of the body and above the body to be able to see and hear what happens around their lifeless body. That is associated with this understanding that they're okay, and they don't seem, the people experiencing that are not too concerned about their lifeless body. They feel themselves separate from their body. Whatever pain they were experiencing prior to their cardiac arrest is absent. Sometimes they come to a dark room and a tunnel of light, and then another world of great beauty. They often meet a being of light, and with this being of light is unconditional love and wisdom. And then the fifth element is a life review. Now, there are other elements, but I want to focus on this life review. And they call it a panoramic life review because it's not this happened and then this happened and then this happened and this happened. It's like it's your whole life all at once, and somehow you can understand it in this state. Everything. In the panoramic life review, they come back and they tell you that they experience all acts, words, and thoughts that you've ever had are kept along with how they affect other people. They experience all acts from the past, even as a child or a baby. For instance, they remember taking a plaything from their little sister. But at the same time, there's this understanding of the sorrow that that act, or the sorrow that arose from that act in their little sister. So they're not experiencing it as they lived it. They're experiencing it along with that moral aspect that we're talking about, how their actions actually affect other people. They're feeling that as well. So with this, there's a feeling of connection with everyone in their past, and they see very clearly in each situation if you give love or if you did not give love in each situation. And coming back from this very intense experience, this is the most important thing when they come back from their cardiac arrest and their panoramic life review, whether they gave love or did not give love in each situation. That's how they see themselves. That's the important thing, not how much money they made, not how much people thought of them, but whether they gave love or did not give love in each situation. And this is another way to state Dharma. This is another way to state Dharma. They come back with the understanding it is the intention of one's thoughts and words and acts which is important, whether one is trying to give love or not. It is a life insight experience, not just reliving with ordinary memory. You really experience how you lived from this perspective of giving or not giving love. And the insight comes, from this, the insight comes when they return to their bad heart or whatever else they've got. The insight comes to know how you should change if you want to do life better. You may not do it right away, but the insight comes, the clarity comes in how to change directions and where you should change directions from this near-death experience in the panoramic life review. In that panoramic life review, during that panoramic life review, they experience that they are connected with everybody else all the time, even connected with deceased relatives. Coming back from it, they feel that you're always connected. So people say it is an experience of unity, an experience of oneness. And when they come back, they still have a residuum of that feeling that you're connected with everything and everybody, the planet Earth and nature as well. And it's so odd for many of these people. There's no correlation between their belief system, their religious belief system, belief in God or not, or whether they believed in the near-death experience or not, and whether they had it or not. For many people, they don't want to talk about it. This doctor would interview a lot of these people himself, and he said, you'd ask him, did anything happen? Do you remember anything from the time that during which your heart was stopped? And if they said no, why do you ask? He said, that means you have to talk with them at least for an hour before they'll open up. Because they're so it's come from the blue. It's so far out of normal awareness, they don't know what happened to themselves. And they think it's odd, and they're not going to open up unless they feel safe. So he says you have to talk to them for at least an hour before they'll actually tell you what happened. And he says, after listening to thousands of near-death experiences, you have to reconsider the never-proven assumption that consciousness, subjective consciousness, is a product of brain function. It's a well-entrenched but unproven assumption. One of the people that reported this to him said, my body, my life, and the whole world suddenly hit me like a prison. This life is bondage. It's a spiritual awakening for many of these people. They might not be ready for it, you see. Whether they change their life, what they do with it, it's very tough on a lot of people. So they did a follow-up 2 or 3 days after the experience. And they used, see, this is very well designed, they used the cardiac arrest patients who did not report near-death experiences in that first interview as controls. And they came back 2 years later and 8 years later with interviews. They followed up. That's why the study took a long time. And what they found out was there were permanent effects among the people who had the near-death experience that did not at all occur in the control group. 0 in the control group. Here are the 3 effects. 1, loss of the fear of death. That's pretty significant. 2, the important thing in life is unconditional love and compassion to others and nature. First, watch yourself, see yourself objectively, and accept your own negative aspects. 3, enhanced intuitive sensitivity. Coming back from this experience, they found they had an enhanced ability to empathize and to feel what other people feel or think. This sense of being connected to other people that they had in the near-death experience persisted to a degree when they came back from their cardiac arrest experience. Now, this doesn't prove that all these things are true, but it corroborates several of the things that we've been talking about with respect to the law of karma that comes from the testimony of the scriptures and sages. One of which is that all these samskaras are stored. Secondly, that the mind survives the death of the brain. And third, that we're not the body. So let's keep this in mind as we discuss some of the other factors in karma. Karma and its effect are recognized by St. Paul in his letters to the Galatians. He says, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to his flesh shall reap of the flesh corruption, but he that soweth of the Spirit shall reap life everlasting." It's a law of cause and effect on the moral plane. Karma is a law of justice, and justice is conditional. If you do any good deed, you are rewarded. If you do anything wrong, you are punished. But divine grace is unconditional. It doesn't take notice of your deservingness. It is given as a boon, as a favor. Yet both have their places in human life. The law of karma functions within a certain range, but beyond the law of karma is the scope of grace. And where exactly does karma function? Karma's work associated with egoism. I am the owner of this body and mind, and the controller of me and mine. I can make and unmake my situation very well. I can take care of myself, and I can even take care of the world without God. This is the law. This is the realm of karma. This is the realm where karma functions. Okay, so okay. You do this, you get that. You do that, you get this. Like a ping pong ball. Birth and death, hope and fear, love and hate, happiness and misery. Okay. As long as we think we are the doer and claim the result, it will come back to us, according to the law of karma and according to St. Paul in his epistles. But beyond karma's grace, if a person surrenders herself to God, then there is room for grace. Why surrender the ego idea to God? Why do that? Well, one has to wake up. And as I said, this waking up process can be quite sudden, or it can be quite gradual. And I don't know which is better, really. But we'll all wake up eventually. And this waking up comes with the kind of understanding that I just articulated from the near-death experience, that if I do good, good will come back to me. And if I do bad, bad will come back to me. So, from this perspective, it makes sense to be a good person. It's very practical. You want to have good things happen to you, so you do good. It's okay. All right. Let me be a good person. No more evil deeds. I'll do good things. That'll get me into favorable situation. But does this solve the problem? Does being a good person solve the problem? Any situation, no matter how good in this world, is not the kind of freedom that the human mind really longs for. We seek unalloyed joy, unmixed blessing, and complete freedom. There is no prospect for the fulfillment of unalloyed joy, complete freedom, and unmixed blessing in the relative existence. Karma is time-bound. It has a beginning and it has an end. Even heaven is unsatisfactory, should it exist. Nothing non-eternal can lead us to the eternal. Karma at work with associated egoism and ownership must keep us in the drama of birth and death. As long as we hold to our egoism, our karma produces results. Now, saying that the result of karma is inevitable doesn't mean that you can't do anything about it. It is inevitable only if it is left to itself. It will not die of itself. It will be with us wherever we go, even after death. But it can be counteracted or mitigated. Karma doesn't mean a kind of fate that we have created through our own past action that cannot be overcome. Karma will wait for an opportunity passively, but it won't go to anybody and say, help me reach fruition. It won't go out and advertise, it's time for me to come out and do something, please come forward. No. It's a little more mysterious than that. Karma is not inevitable because the ego is not the real agent of work. The real agent is beyond karma. This agent is free. It is the Atman. By using the body and mind, his instrument, there is a certain amount of freedom that can be manifest to change the body and mind. And this takes us into the realm of karma yoga. Intentionally surrendering the ego and the fruits of action to the Divine Lord, to our Ishta, or working unselfishly without an idea of the personal God, just to forget ourselves in that doing good. That can also lead us to freedom. So we need to talk a little bit about grace. And Sri Ramakrishna talks about it in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. How with the attenuating of egoism, grace functions. He says one cannot see God without his grace. Is it an easy thing to receive God's grace? One must altogether renounce egoism. One cannot see God as long as one feels, I am the doer. God does not easily appear in the heart of a man who feels himself to be his own master, but God can be seen the moment his grace descends. So we're not completely bound by the law of karma. It has a limited range, and we can easily transcend the bounds of karma. But God's grace does not work against egoism. If someone holds to egoism but prays to God, he will get grace in some form or other, relief from a catastrophe, wealth, fame, and so forth. So there are two types of grace. There's the type of grace where you win your lawsuit. And you can pray very fervently for that. But that's not the type of grace that frees you from the bonds of birth and death. It might develop your relationship with God, and it's important in that sense. But there's that type of grace which works in the relative plane, and then there's the type of grace that takes us beyond the relative plane, when we become disillusioned with what can be attained in this world of cause and effect. Now we can ask, if God is all-merciful, why doesn't God help when I am subject to egoism? Why doesn't he say, well, you've had that problem long enough, come on now. Everything in the world has its way. Justice has its way, and grace has its way. God cannot face defiance. If we hold to the ego and somehow or other defy God or ignore God or deny God, I can get on very well without God. This isn't the proper place for grace to function. This is the place for karma to function. Sri Ramakrishna continues, suppose in a family a man has taken charge of the storeroom. Then if someone asks the master of the house, Sir, will you kindly give me, you yourself kindly give me something from your storeroom? The master of the house says, oh, he says, there's already some fellow in the storeroom. What can I do there? Well, that fellow is our egoism, taking ownership of the master's storeroom. You know? I mean, what do we own in this? What do we own in this world? We're just renters. We're just taking care of it for the time being. Our possessions are going to outlive this body, you know. So there's this guy who thinks he owns that place. It's my storeroom, but you have to go to him if you want it. So what can I do? So that little guy in the storeroom has to kind of give it up and says, okay, it actually belongs to you, before God's grace can function and you can get what is God's directly from God. As long as we hold to the ego and defend ourselves by hook or crook, we're subject to law. This is the way in the human world. If you're under law and justice, that takes care of you. When we try to find all kinds of defense mechanisms to defend ourselves, we're under the domain of justice. But when we surrender to the supreme authority and implore mercy, then mercy comes. So it is in the spiritual world. When we surrender to God, then God's grace comes. As Sri Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, it is very difficult, this relative existence formed of the three gunas, the components of Maya. But those who worship me, resigning all actions to me, regarding me as the supreme goal, meditating upon me with single-minded devotion, to those whose minds are thus set on me, I become ere long, O Arjuna, the savior from this death-fraught ocean of the world. When you succeed in surrendering your egoism completely, then you can even become one with God. Sri Krishna says in chapter 10 of the Gita, I am the origin of all. From me all things evolve. Thus thinking, the wise worship me with loving consciousness, with their minds fully in me, with their senses absorbed in me, enlightening one another about me. Always speaking of me, they are satisfied and delighted. To them ever steadfast in serving me with affection, I give that understanding by which they come to me. Out of compassion for them, I, abiding in their hearts, destroy the darkness in them, born of ignorance, with the luminous light of knowledge.
Any questions?
Oh. Yes. Can we see the law of karma as a part of divine grace itself because it helps us go beyond the law of karma? That's an interesting question. I've created this world so that you suffered, and that's my first grace. I suppose you could look at it that way. Thank you, Lord. But you know, in one of the reminiscences of Sri Ramakrishna, it's a very interesting one that I looked at recently by someone who was a contemporary of Swami Vivekananda. And they had a mutual friend, and the mutual friend said, come, I want to introduce you to this young man who's extraordinary. He says, why do you want to introduce me to this young man who's extraordinary? Well, you're the most interesting person in our circle of friends, and he's the most interesting person in this other circle of friends, and I think you ought to meet each other. Well, so he said, okay. I think this last mate. Anyway, I'll get the name for you. The name is escaping me right now. So what happened is he says, oh, okay, so let's go over to so-and-so's house. And they go over there, and Narendra is there. And he's at that time seeing Sri Ramakrishna. And they're not too far away from Dakshineswar. And this guy is just full of fun and witty. And you get another perspective on Narendra because this man who gives his reminiscences is a writer himself. And Narendra says, oh, he says, there's this Paramahamsa over at the Kali temple. Let's go over and see him. See, and so Narendra is just kind of getting his feet wet here with Sri Ramakrishna. Maybe it's kind of unclear exactly where he was in that process, but he'd probably already realized from his first encounters that Sri Ramakrishna was kind of a spiritual powerhouse. And he says, oh, he says, he's an amazing person. I don't care about anything he says, but let's go over there and see him. And they go over there. And then this, while they're there, Ramakrishna goes into samadhi, and Narendra turns to this fellow that he just met, and he'd earlier said, have you seen Ramakrishna? You live so close. He says, no, my brother wrote me from some other part of India. He said, you ought to go see the Paramahamsa and write an article about him. So Ramakrishna goes into samadhi. Everything stops. Narendra's watching him very carefully. And over his shoulder, he says to this young man, he says, now you can write your brother 4 pages. And this interaction is the main part of this, the reminiscence. And Ramakrishna comes down, Sri Ramakrishna comes down from samadhi, and Ramakrishna says, come more often, and we're just getting to know each other. And he says, he tells Ramakrishna to his face, I don't care about all that stuff you tell me. I know all that stuff. I know all that stuff. So Ramakrishna's reply is, good, I won't need to talk so much. Yeah, but just come once. He extracts a promise. And the person that's writing the reminiscence says, I saw Sri Ramakrishna several times after that. But this interaction that I saw between the young Swami Vivekananda and this amazing spiritual giant, he says, will be with me for the rest of my life. And his last meeting with Ramakrishna, he goes, and there's no one there except this young man. And he asks Ramakrishna to bless him. And Ramakrishna says, oh, he says, it's not time yet. He says, it's necessary to suffer before you can get the blessing. It's necessary to suffer. So, it wasn't time yet for this young man. He kind of had a little intellectual understanding, but his heart really wasn't quite there yet to receive it. So that suffering is necessary, but usually we associate God's grace with that kind of unconditioned. I mean, it's not says, well, give me this because I think I should have it. It's like, man, I've tried everything, and I don't want this world anymore. I know there's something beyond. I know this isn't real. I want the reality, and then God's grace comes. So it's sort of something else. It's partly the way we talk about it. It's the case. And it's interesting, this reminiscence that I'm reminded of that I mentioned to you. 4 pages. Anything else? Yes.
I have a question regarding the near-death experience.
Yeah.
That you
Yes.
related to the issue of karma and the possibility that divine grace can eventually have the opportunity to feel what the impact of our actions is in other people.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we just see it normally since we are born and going through the world? I'm just wondering how much suffering would that save if we had that capability of being open and
That's a very good question.
feel exactly the impact of our actions. Because it seems to me that it's too much work, and if you go through all
Yeah, yeah.
the charges,
Yeah.
you know, how many lives, how much suffering.
Yeah, how many billions of years, you know,
How
that's,
do you know that if you want,
yeah,
divine grace is there?
yeah.
So why are we not educated that way? Or why, I don't know. I just find-
No, your question is a good one. I'm thinking about it. And I think it has to do with our very deep sense of identification with our I think it comes from a very deep-seated sense of identification with our rental property. We think we own it. We think we are that. And this blocks those more subtle perceptions that are available to people when they are not identified with the body during the near-death experience, and where they are not identified with the body during deep meditation. These things can also happen during meditation, these awarenesses. So it's a matter of our experience of reality, and whether that is gross or subtle. And evidently, that's something that takes a long time and lots of experience to shift, it seems to me. Maybe there are ways of expediting it. I think yoga is a way of expediting it. You know, we have techniques that have been worked out by the sages and saints that can help us develop in that direction, but it still takes time and effort. And, you know, Swami Ashokananda talks about this there are a number of books that have come out of our Vedanta Society of Northern California that Marie-Louise Burke edited. And he was very original in his expression of things. And he'd say, suppose, he says, why not just, why all this work in spiritual life? I mean, why is there so much work and time and effort, and why is all that involved? He says, well, if you want to go to the top of Everest, you see, you have to spend $60,000. You have to get at least 10 Sherpas to help you. You have to get the equipment so you can breathe up there. It takes time. You have to learn the skills so you don't fall off the mountain. He didn't go into this, I don't remember the exact, but I'm sort of developing it as a parallel example. He says, and then you can climb the mountain, and you'll be okay, and you can come back down. He said, but, if someone throws you up there in a helicopter, you're going to be miserable. You can't breathe. It's too cold. You don't have any Sherpas to carry your stuff. You'll die up there. He says, that's our condition. What we think we want is this divine grace, but we have to prepare ourselves for it. We have to prepare ourselves for that expedition. And it takes time, effort, intention, perseverance. And then we can be okay at the top of the mountain. Very good question. Thank you.